Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much. I think with that introduction, there's I've given a brief background of myself, but fair to say I've been with Oliver Wight now for about 5 years, and as mentioned, very excited to be here with you this afternoon, and for those who are on the West Coast in the morning, and talk a little bit today about some multiple views and some demand management best practices. So why don't we begin just by looking at our agenda. We are going to go through an overview of some best practices related to demand management, just to level set and to give each of you an opportunity to think through, regardless of where you might be in your demand management journey, around some sharing of examples and ideas and concepts, and then also relate those best practices to what we call multiple views, and leveraging statistical or baseline views with new and updated information covering the entire 24-plus month planning horizon. What might be some existing information that we could leverage? What is consensus mean, and how do we derive consensus from a multiple view planning process? Then we'll go into a demo using some software and ultimately tie that back to this effort around improving demand plan accuracy. And as we think about the discussion today, touching throughout the role and importance of the thinking and the words behind numbers called assumptions. So we have a few key subjects to cover. We're going to have an opportunity at the end also for some questions, and really just get you thinking a little bit, again, for those who may be starting their planning journey, here's some more nuggets, 1 or 2, maybe 3 things I can take back to my own company. And for those who are further along the journey, maybe reinforcing what you already knew, and also building upon some other ideas to ensure your continued success. A little bit about Oliver Wight. For those who aren't familiar, Oliver Wight, the company, was named after our founder, Oliver Wight, a global consulting firm founded in 1969. I like to say that each of us came from real jobs, real industry jobs. I was a demand manager at numerous companies before I joined Oliver Wight. And the company itself really was rooted and came from a history of education and MRP2 and the forerunners of SNOP, which we coined and also expanded and socialized through numerous countries and organizations over the past 3 to 4 decades. Really, our benefits are around time to results and ownership and independence as we think about implementing not just IBP, SNOP, but also best practice demand planning and demand management processes. Aside from some white papers, other thought leadership, including this webinar, and a deep reservoir of best practices that you can find on our website and other places, we also have authored many books. Personal favorite here is the demand management book that you'll see here in the upper left-hand corner, and of course some other ones that are very pertinent to supply chain overall. Again, good references and good material. Be happy to discuss or share with you more as we think about this discussion today or even offline. Just to kind of kick things off here, I thought it might be helpful to share with you a little bit about real life situations. And so we're migrating really from what may be theory or conceptual concepts or ideas to what are some real life challenges that many of you may be facing today, some situations you may be dealing with, and then what are some best practices. We will be exploring leveraging tools, not abandoning tools or seeing that tools don't apply, but how can we leverage tools, software, and other pieces of information to build the best view of demand, to help grow the business, and also to provide accurate plans for the business. And so in our situation here, as you kind of look through the bullet points on the screen, it's really intended to give you an overview and a level setting of maybe it's the situation you're in today, which is I'm a demand planner or demand manager, and there could be a feeling of persecution or being blamed. And of course, leadership role in saying, let's find a way to work through the issues. And I alone am not responsible for a poor number as an output of either a statistical system or a process, but there's got to be a better way. So the good news is, through years of experience and best practices and some real client examples, we believe there is a path forward, obviously. There's a use of a statistical forecast, but it shouldn't be followed blindly. And instead of using the term forecasting, we're going to focus on demand planning, which is a consolidation of multiple views, inputs, of accountabilities and roles that align closely with maybe how you're structured today or how you're going to be structured to provide the organization with the best, not just number, but perspective rooted in assumptions over the entire horizon. One of the other key takeaways, besides getting to a more accurate plan, is that there should be a replanning process. There should be an opportunity, for example, in any kind of business where new insights, consumer trends, information is received, analyzed, reviewed, documented, and shared. And so inputs in the demand plan on a monthly cadence feels right to us, regardless of industries we've worked with. And again, as we think about the extended planning horizon, could shape and drive different discussions and really stimulate demand efforts. I wanted to share with you a survey that was taken prior to this call. And the question here is, how satisfied are you with your ability to gather information from multiple sources when creating a monthly plan? And I continue to be surprised that roughly 87% of responses of people who answer this question were either somewhat or not satisfied. And again, leveraging what we have in place, if it's tools or software, is a great starting point and can be absolutely used to help project demand plans. But this is also, I think, a response to lack of coherent processes around how tools can be organized, used, shared, really exploited. So I'm of the mindset that we should leverage information where it makes sense, but also how do we build a process or perhaps tighten or strengthen the existing process around the demand space to really drive maximum value and benefit. So if you're in this area of not satisfied or somewhat satisfied, you're not alone. Many organizations we deal with feel exactly the same way you do. The real value, I think, in part of the conversation we have today is how do I start if I haven't thought about maybe involving other people? Who might those people in the organization in my current structure be? And then what kinds of information might I extract or hope to extract that makes sense? Not trying to boil the ocean, but what can I leverage to create a good demand plan rooted in good assumptions that can then be reviewed on a consistent, monthly basis. We are going to begin with a definition of demand management. And this definition of demand management may feel like a very much a sales and marketing perspective versus what you may be accustomed to in terms of I'm a demand planner, I'm managing an input or a couple inputs on a monthly basis. It really is a commercial lens of the business. So from an enterprise perspective, Oliver Wight has a view that says there is a strategic plan and objective and should be managed through an integrated business planning process. And if I look at the product management review, which is the compilation of portfolio, project, and resource management, are projects on scope, on budget, on cost every single month? Am I actively seeking to align my plans and strategies with the long-term objectives of the organization? Leveraging innovation coming into the demand review, where I have integrated sales and marketing plans to achieve the strategies would seem to make sense. And so if it's Kotler's definition from a market perspective, we're talking about influencing the level, timing, and composition of demand in order to achieve a company's objectives and goals. Clearly, we're not talking about going through this effort and this work in terms of compilation of multiple views to facilitate a conversation going out 3 quarters. There's got to be a conversation depending upon your business that makes sense in terms of plan horizon, but we would say, and we'll talk more about this, that a minimum monthly horizon, a monthly plan, should extend over 24 plus months. We are in business to grow the business. And so now we depart from forecasting and even some planning around a couple pieces of inputs into managing. So we're influencing, we're directing, we're guiding. And by the way, we're not victim to demand over the entire horizon. In the integrated business planning model, which some or all of you may be familiar with, there is a 5-step process, a series of 5 steps that occur on a monthly basis. I had mentioned the product review very briefly, and then the demand review. The unconstrained demand is an output of that process. You'll notice the arrows really correspond to strategy throughout, but the output of the demand review is a formal request for product, an unconstrained, not bound by what supply can or cannot do. It's saying that there's an unconstrained view that we need to give the organization if our goal in demand management is truly to help grow the business, that supply can say yes or yes but to, with alternatives and recommendations. And so the three corners of this process, three supporting legs, fundamental processes are around product, demand, and supply, are represented not just in terms of units or widgets, but also the corresponding volume and value, dollars, EBITDA, etc., that are then reconciled monthly, and latest recommendations and views are presented to the management business review. So this five-step model is a continuous process. It's not just a sequential series of steps. And one of the big benefits about the demand review and integrated business planning, especially if you haven't yet embarked upon this journey, is really around improved communication. And don't mistake the arrows for one way, meaning that there's only one direction that communication is flowing. It's really about inputs and outputs, a consistent monthly cadence, looking over the extended horizon that says I have the latest assumptions, risks, and opportunities of the marketplace that I'm projecting to the broader organization, and then review those and replan those on a monthly basis. This model has a lot of different pieces to it, but what I wanted to share with you is there is not just aggregate plans being formed above that dotted line through an integrated business planning process as we define what a product management review, demand review, and supply review might feel like. There is also detailed activities that many of you may be struggling with today. There are stage and gate processes that feed what we call a product management review. So toll gates or launch gates. Do I have a sufficient number of projects to meet my strategic objectives? Those are kinds of discussions that would surface through, and even resources, through a product management review. In the demand review, it's not just the 6 to 24 plus month view. I'm also talking about the entire horizon, which may be in the next quarter I struggle with what we call demand control or demand execution type of activities. And so there may be different levels of granularity and kinds of considerations and information that may flow that I have to deal with. When I have customers that put in opportunities or change plans, then how do I deal with those? And some of those may be opportunistic. So it's not just the negative, or we don't just say no. How do we deal with that from a commercial perspective? So market management, sales management, we are managing, we are not victims. We are proactive. We are going to get better again next month, learning from assumptions. But if it's new product launches, if it's opportunities, if it's customers changing plans, those are all dealt with below the line, and those also feed a longer-term aggregate demand plan. And on the supply chain side, we also understand that there's a master scheduling and detailed scheduling activities. The ability to connect the aggregate plans on a monthly basis above this dotted line through an integrated business planning process with the detailed activities sets the organization up for success. It means we don't miss opportunities, there's a connection, and we revisit those plans and assumptions every single month. And by the way, we also touch different layers of the organization. So I could be a manager or a VP, but I also could be a person who's in the key account area who's, not actually at the mothership or at the home office. And so it ties activities and connections. In this way, we are more apt to succeed and develop general consensus, general agreement on those plans every single month. And as I tell one client, nothing is fatal. So over a 24-month plan horizon, you have 23 times to get it right. You are able to plan and replan those plans and those assumptions every single month because business dynamics is just that, dynamic, and things will change over the entire business horizon. A very powerful yet simple graphic is what we at Oliver Wight would say is the best practice when it comes to multiple views of demand. In fact, we might just want to change the header of this title from consider to why wouldn't you consider multiple views of demand? You may be an organization where you have some historical observations and data that you can leverage through a statistical tool, and we'll see the value through a demo here shortly about leveraging base information. But we'll also see how software as an enabler, perhaps through increased notes management and adding the words behind the numbers, could also create views and what I call key figures, or give us the ability to represent what the sales perspective might be in that tool or tools, because we know that it could be different than simply an algorithm. And by the way, think about your own businesses. How many times have what you've done in the past, what you've shipped in the past, what you've delivered in the past, is a fair representation of what you expect to deliver in the future? There may be some items that absolutely statistically are a good fit. But our experiences in the vast majority of organizations, if you're subject to promotions, to events, to the kinds of things that are going to cause some questioning, then a multiple view of demand model is a best practice. Strategy is not just exist in words or thoughts or concepts. It's absolutely the guardrails by which you may choose to manage categories, segments, product lines of your business. And it's not just a percentage growth. It should have some key initiatives around it that could dovetail into nice discussion as part of your demand planning and demand management process. We mentioned briefly around the product portfolio. Customer input. Customers do have plans. It may not feel like that. It could be at an aggregate level versus actually detailed SKU, and that's okay. But some of these customers, as they understand and you can share information with them, we're more likely to give you information. So there's both an input and an output back to customers we found to be very helpful. And marketing and brand. So if it's thinking about, just some of the inputs from promotions, events, and you have to decide what makes sense for your business, you're really asking questions. And I like to, maybe it's my age, I like to think of our job as a demand planner, demand manager sometimes as Columbo. You're asking questions. For those who don't know who Columbo is, that's okay. But asking questions, being investigative, being a questioner through the monthly process of, what am I missing, and being curious about how the business is forming, what kind of dynamics are occurring in the marketplace as inputs. If those inputs don't apply that month, then don't consider them. But if they do, ask what is applicable with the appropriate provider of those inputs, and generate consensus based upon information, and don't just debate the numbers, which can be fatal, timely, and extremely frustrating. So one of my favorite slides, we are not in the weather business. Oliver Wight has many clients, for example, that are involved in agriculture or where weather is a factor in demand. But it's not a hope, it's not a wish or a dream, the demand plan. It's not a weather forecast. It's absolutely assumption-ridden process, assumption-laden process. And by the way, if you're an organization where you may be struggling with supply chain's ability to meet that demand, through a demand planning process and best practice demand management process and integrated business planning process, if you request product and they're able to deliver that over time as you strengthen those assumptions and capability, you're also accountable for making that sale happen. So demand plan is the series of activities to create demand based upon multiple views, and also assign commercial accountabilities for executing that plan. And consensus feels like we have alignment not just on the assumptions, but also that we agree to execute it, to service key customers, to service key categories. And so the process is not forecasting, it is planning. And often when we work with individuals and clients, we begin the discussion around a forecast that may go out 3 months or 6 months, and that's okay. Sometimes forecast actually gets interladen with demand plan, which is two different things, as we described here. The forecast is like predicting the weather. I use the example, we used to go to hotels and the USA Today would be there, and the back page of it was the weather. And if you look at the forecast going out even next day, it'll say sunny and 78 degrees, and you wake up and it's rainy and 50 degrees. We never call up the editor and say you were wrong. We just assume that the accountability is relatively low, that a forecast absolutely denotes a high degree of inaccuracy, and that really the difference, again, is around who is taking action and determining. We're not victims to the plan, we're creating a plan. And we also get a vote in terms of updating that plan every single month. It's not a point in time, it's a continuous conversation. So a very simple but yet important observation that I have in working with organizations is, we want to move past forecasting as an event, as a number, as something that we hold and persecute people to planning. It's also easier to hold people accountable for a plan when we understand how that plan was formed. And so those assumptions become very important. Those are the underpinning of the numbers. When you have multiple views, you now have a conversation around people's thinking and what drives them to put in those numbers as you think about driving supply chain and other financial activities for the organization. So I want to share with you that while much of this may feel new to some of you and may feel like a lot of work, I have some observations and some thoughts. And that is one of our best practice principles is also take advantage of existing information. And so as we think about where do I start as we look at the wheel that maybe Todd showed you around multiple views, statistical, product, brand management, strategy, boy, that seems like a lot of stuff. Well, is there activity that you're doing, however it may not seem coordinated at this time, but is there activity that you may have line of sight to or through a series of questions be able to extract? It could be one family or subfamily or a list of items that say, yeah, we promote these, right? So we actually are involved, we are a business that promotes product. Understanding, for example, what past promotions have done and then what upcoming promotions are planned may be a good conversation. Do we still believe those assumptions? And who could provide some input into how those promotions were formed? Pricing is another good one, not just tactical, but also strategic. And what might be the response of our customers, knowing their pricing impact might be on the horizon, and of course, new product launches, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a lot of information that sometimes when we become fully integrated, meaning that we have a forum, we have a process, it's not just a series of sticky notes and emails, do we start thinking about people have information sometimes at their fingertips, sometimes not, but at least they have information that when asked a series of right questions are willing to share and integrate into a process that can yield the best business discussion. So long before, thinking about even creating new Visios or creating new flowcharts or reworking Excel sheets, have the conversation around the way you're structured that makes sense to you. We are a business that does this. Therefore, we should have some information or some people in these roles. What do they know? And I can honestly share with you also, I did a design workshop one time and asked where macroeconomic indicators came from because that was important to this business. And a hand went up at the back of the room. And we asked everybody to turn their head and said, who's that? And we found out this was a person who was already monitoring some macroeconomic indicators every quarter. And so we didn't need to create new information. We actually said, let's leverage some of the great work, some charts and data this person already has as an input to our demand planning and demand review. It became very important and critical and also saved the teams a lot of work as they thought about best practice demand management. There may be a lot of factors that you feel influence demand. And if you sit back and think about those and group them perhaps in terms of external versus internal, it may help as you get your arms around what are some of the big drivers in my business. So these are very generic, but some that we've seen that I'd just like to share with you. So when I think about assumptions, what are the demand drivers, in other words, that are significant, that we understand or think we should start tracking? Working in an oil and gas environment, absolutely. If it's governmental action or economic conditions, that was a big piece for us. In many of your businesses, you have competition, obviously. What's the right level of information that you think would be important? What about just general market conditions? And not so much GDP or macroeconomic, what are some specific things that would be important? Labeling changes or, FDA regulations, fundamental trends and insights that you're seeing you can't control, but you choose to monitor just to ensure that it forces a discussion about how you may change an assumption in your plan going forward. And of course, internal, there could be things that you do. So pricing, promotions, do you launch new products? If so, is it clear what the assumptions are around when those new products will hit? What stage are they in their stage and gate or development process? And of course, these assumptions could be documented at multiple levels. So often we think about product hierarchy, items, and SKUs, and groupings, but they could be overall business. Don't discount the level of granularity as you think for those who are demand planners or demand managers that might be helpful. It could be an overall business or channel, and it could be something as simple as 5% growth year over year in terms of a category that we can then extrapolate. We could then time phase, over time. So it just depends. I just want to share with you some examples and some thoughts around assumptions. When I mentioned the planning horizon before, a best practice is a monthly cadence. The demand planning and demand management process at a minimum should be looking at changes in assumptions, risks, and opportunities on a monthly basis, projecting and communicating those changes and representing those in an easy to say story, easy to tell story. And I think one of the best ways is a simple visual. This is in a chart in Excel. You may have some other ways that you like to look at information for those who are doing this. But we're really saying that the best practice should be a minimum 24-month rolling, every month review of the demand plan and also changes in demand. And so this example here, because we're focused on the future, with a little bit of history in the back, we have shipments over the last 3 months for this particular widget. We have red, which is our demand plan, by month loaded, and we also have the blue tips, which is new products. And so if you have some assumptions around, we expect to launch products that will account for 50% of our business by volume or dollars in this category, I would expect to see that in your represented demand plan going forward. And it may be helpful to test that assumption just by actually marking it a different color. So new product demand could be a different color than products already in my portfolio that I've actually been shipping and selling for a while. So just a thought if you haven't done it that way before. In the background, I have a budget shaded in blue. And really what I'm trying to do here is just tie my assumptions around growth from a budget and strategic perspective to, am I on track with my latest demand plan assumptions? And so this example here, if I just pick on a month of June 2009, I have what's called a classic gap between my latest assumptions, the sum of my demand plan in red and blue, the top of that tip, which is between 200 and 250,000 units of this widget, and my budget, which says I need to be at 350,000. And that may not set off alarm bells right away, but when you see that gap and it's in the future, you have time to react. If it's near term, it gives you a much different perspective, and it may be a much different conversation. So this 24-month horizon becomes very important. By the way, this is a minimum. We work with organizations where it could be up to 5 to 7, 10 years, depending upon your product lead times and innovation lead times. But we would say at a minimum, we've yet to work with a business where it's not 24 months. So you get out of that accordion, end of year type of cycle, you give yourself a chance to actually be successful. And for those who say, I have no idea what it's going to be in 24 months, well, guess what? Try it. You may like it. Nothing's fatal. It gives you time to react. And no one's doing anything with the information today anyway, if that's the case. Just try it and force the discussion. It could be derived from your strategic year-over-year growth plans as well. But again, just a thought, a sharing of a best practice. We've talked a little bit about some assumptions already. I think that the most important takeaway here is around the process to manage changes. And changes should be encouraged. So if you're in an organization, for example, where you have a budget and it equals the demand plan and someone says, thou shalt not change it, I would challenge them. I would challenge them professionally on the basis of what assumptions do you see in your role if you're a demand planner or demand manager that you know are dynamic and have changed. And I'd rather be working in a business where I actually have bad news early versus bad news late. Just like our gap example, if those assumptions cause a difference in volumes or revenue, now we have time to actually formulate plans through either improved opportunities, through challenging the commercial organization around customer growth and plans, to focus on emerging or growing categories. So we are making decisions. We are proactive, right? We are not victims. We are taking action. And we're also not using assumptions to shape as a basis for excuses. We are saying we are not going to wait another year and hope the fourth quarter pulls us through. And I've been there. This is about now taking proactive action. And the only way to do that is to look further enough in the future to say, what does my landscape look like? So this process of demand planning and demand management, culminating in a monthly demand review, absolutely is not now a nice to have, it's a must have. And successful organizations and world-class organizations use this process to drive gap closures, but not just to meet plans, but often to exceed growth targets. It becomes a positive discussion, liberating discussion about meeting strategic objectives and growth. Consensus, as we kind of think about the culmination of inputs, assumptions, and looking over the extended horizon feels like general agreement. And it doesn't necessarily mean that if you were running a demand planning, demand management process where you get in a room and align on assumptions, that it's simple or easy, or that it doesn't have spirited conversations. It's saying we are tough on issues, we are not tough on people, but we absolutely, if I was in that meeting, would expect everyone to speak, an opportunity to speak, and we're talking about facts and information, and we also have the agreement to live with the group's decision. So we're absolutely focused on business, not personalities, but we must come to some alignment, because if we don't have agreement and consensus on the plans, we will not have consensus on the execution. And this is also what we see for those organizations who run multiple sets of numbers. And if I go back and look at some of the root causes, because we never had alignment on the plan to begin with. Alignment doesn't mean that we don't have different opinions, just to sum this up. It means that we have general agreement on the underlying assumptions. And if we have a monthly planning cadence and we're looking further out, we get time next month to replan. So again, it's a continuous input and output process. It's about general agreement. And we're also not debating and revisiting issues and decisions every single month that should have been decided upon. It's actually quite liberating. Some examples of roles and responsibilities in a multiple view consensus process. And this is just an example. This may or may not apply to your particular business, but I just want to share with you, if you are a brand manager, many of you may be demand planners or demand managers, you know that you are responsible for certain pieces of information, but in a multiple view consensus process, just an example that may help you get your mind around what kind of information may I be extracting from sales, for example, and what level of detail, and who's accountable for the kinds of information. So yes, Todd, we have a sales group. This is what I get today. You may challenge them and say, could you actually get me some customer information? And the response may be, well, you're asking for SKU level detail. This is where you use a demand planner or demand manager. Also would be important for you to hear that you can't give a 65,000 row Excel data set to somebody and expect them to fill it out every single month. What about the changes? What about channels? What about key accounts, right? And so we are thinking now as a trusted advisor working with the commercial organization, extracting key pieces of information that make sense, that are significant changes, but we begin that discussion by understanding the kinds of inputs. And again, the level of granularity I think is an important point, because I see sometimes, and I've been there as well, some organizations get tripped up on just because we need detail to feed ERP systems doesn't mean that's where the conversation starts or ends, depending upon the kinds of inputs that are most critical for us to be successful. That's why we have demand planners and demand managers to disaggregate and to synthesize information. Your role is to ask the question around what kind of information we need to start the conversation and to build consensus around those views. So consensus, as I go in my spirit of asking questions, could feel like a series of new pieces of information that are coming through the process every single month. And our goal is to focus on points of disagreement, which may be counterintuitive. If we're going to have multiple pieces of information, we're never going to have perfect agreement. What we are going to have is enough information based upon from a product perspective or category or channel to say, I'm going to now collate this and organize this in my role as demand manager to help facilitate this conversation. And so it's the role of demand planners and demand managers. And you may say, well, we don't have one of those. Well, this could be where the sales or marketing person takes the lead. But there needs to be a facilitator of multiple pieces of information. And this is a positive discussion because we are now get the best information. Sometimes we could choose to reject it. That's always an option, but at least we have that option. If you're just limited to one piece of information, that's what you're stuck with. So I would much rather be participating in the process where I at least get a vote, my voice is heard, and I also have some new information I'm bringing to the table that I can then work with a demand planner, demand manager, marketer, or salesperson to synthesize the impact. If it's not significant, we don't need to burden ourselves with talking about it. And so as you go through the process of consensus building and demand management, you'll find your way. And for those who are already doing this, congratulations. Keep doing more of it. This is a critical piece of a good demand plan and demand management process. So these assumptions that we've talked about, again, focus on the business and what is driving demand rather than debating the numbers. They arm you. They provide you legitimate questions to ask, and they are the cornerstone of a consensus building process and consensus discussion. Each view represents information that, when translated into assumptions, becomes a talking point, and when documented and reviewed, because all plans are wrong, let me just repeat that, all plans are wrong, all plans will be wrong, the question then becomes, what assumption didn't materialize versus what I thought versus your number is 10% lower or higher than what I thought. That is a fruitless exercise. So rather than get wrapped around the axle, let's talk about what the words are that drive the numbers versus the other way around. And the output of a good demand planning, demand management process looks a lot more like a Word document than an Excel template. We need numbers to drive the supply chain and drive the business, but we align on those numbers through a consistent discussion around the thinking behind those numbers. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Eric, and who's going to give us an overview of Forecast Pro and how we're going to leverage some of these great conversations and discussions using that software.
Okay. Well, thank you, Todd. So again, at this point during the webinar, we're just going to take a couple of minutes and see how software can help facilitate some of the tasks which we've been discussing. We are going to be previewing some Forecast Pro Track version 5, which is not yet out yet. And I know a lot of our attendees today are using this software. So you're going to see a few things, the shape of things to come in the future. But let's start with one of the things that we said is that a statistical forecast is an input into a demand plan. And so one of the things that we can do is to look around at our data. We talked about looking at different dimensions, and for those who are regular guests to our webinar series, this data will probably look pretty familiar. It comes from a commercial bakery that sells muffins and cakes, and their customers are large grocery store chains. So we can look at the data at different levels. We can drill down into, say, this Stuff Mart, which is one of our big customers, and get down to SKUs, etc. I'm going to go ahead and expand this a little bit and give you a feel for the types of things we're looking at. So one of the recurring theme in this webinar is the utility and the usefulness of the different pieces that need to be reviewed, the different views of data. And that's really what I want to concentrate on. And I'm going to use a new feature here, something we call bookmarks. And it's a convenient way to flip between different views of how we work with forecasts, how we work with data. So for example, if I'm generating a statistical forecast, I might want to look at something like this, where I've got a graph of the history, I've got a graph of the forecast. Maybe I have some override capabilities in case I want to make some changes. So, perhaps I'll make some changes and put in comments and document them. But again, one step of the process is someone in this overall process is going to be responsible for generating a statistical forecast, and they'll have the desire to look at this information in a specific way. On the other hand, another step might be where we're going after consensus. So I've got a different view bookmarked here, which is something I might use during, say, an S&OP meeting or a consensus meeting. And we see some of the kind of graphics here that are similar to what Todd was showing earlier in his slides. But the concept of now I'm sharing with a group, I'm looking at other information. I not only have say, a statistical forecast view, but I'm bringing in marketing or maybe customer, et cetera. And therefore, what I want to be looking at is quite different. We're still using a lot of the same information or some of the same inputs, but we're adding inputs and expanding our view to the task at hand. And again, for those Forecast Pro users out there, because I know we do have quite a few that follow this webinar series, you'll notice that, for instance, these graphs are quite different than what you're used to. And version 5 will be allowing you to mix different graph styles and create much more customized displays, and coupled with the ability to flip between different views, we can really facilitate more involved processes in a very intuitive way, and allowing you to look along, again, different dimensions of your products, etc. So again, I won't take too much more of your time here, but what I wanted to say is that the process that you're setting up involves multiple steps. The multiple steps are going to involve different ways of viewing, conveying, and communicating information to different people, and it's useful to be able to use something more than Excel, where we're just looking at a grid full of numbers and maybe little template-based approaches. This sort of gives you more of a live way of doing it, and whether you use Forecast Pro or other data visualization tools, it's really essential as part of the process to help facilitate a good demand review process. So with this, I'd like to return the presentation back to Todd so he can continue to explain the ins and outs for us.
Great, thank you. So as we kind of near the end of our webinar, with a combination of some best practices from the Oliver Wight perspective, and of course the examples you've seen with tools, there's a general theme emerging. Sometimes the question is going to be, just like in our case example, Todd, show me real life. They're on the very first slides. How do we improve our forecast accuracy, right? Which we would now call our demand plan accuracy. But how do we get better at something, at stuff? And by the way, I don't really know what that is. I'm a VP of something, right? But I want you to be better. So through this conversation we're having, hopefully some ideas are emerging, and maybe you're doing a lot of these already, so it's just reinforcing what we're doing as best practice. But for those who aren't, try them. Again, as I mentioned before, you might like it. Multiple views based upon assumptions of inputs that feel more like a conversation versus built-out spreadsheets. And if I have a great tool like the one you've been seeing here, I can leverage those now for one source of the truth. So I can leverage my software tool to say, I have a statistical component that should be leveraged and used, absolutely, where applicable, but I also can layer in multiple views of information, capture that information, and generate a consensus demand plan, much different than a forecast. And as a result, I'm now not focused on getting a number right, but I'm also focused on explaining, my resulting differences between how demand was planned and how it actually formed. It's a much different conversation, because then it ties you back to some assumptions, which can be very, very empowering. Lastly, just to show you some perspective here, often clients embark upon, if it's improved demand planning techniques or processes or demand management, integrated business planning, with the idea we're going to solve for inventory, or we want to actually improve customer service, all noble objectives. But what I really want to share with you is that sometimes some of the biggest benefits are around sales revenue. So when we think about what we're trying to achieve in terms of accuracy and on-time delivery, a percentage increase in revenue compared to some other objectives may not seem large, but if you're a multi-million-dollar organization, isn't the goal of improved process implementation and alignment really about financial improvement? And at the end of the day, yes, improved communication, improved quality of information is very important. But if you're struggling to say, how does this tie back to a narrative I want to have or a discussion I want to have with my boss or my leadership, you can tell them with a lot of confidence that if you try some of these techniques and concepts, the end result should be an improved financial position, because you're absolutely taking guessing out of the equation. You're holding people accountable. You're looking at a plan that can be reformulated and actually replanned every single month. There's greater clarity and understanding. As one executive told me, I understand numbers are going to be wrong. The biggest frustration I have is nobody can tell me why. So we're hopefully getting you there, and hopefully some examples here today that can help you answer the question of why, again, just from our experience. There are a number of different public and private, what we call education tracks or classes that we offer. One of them from an Oliver Wight perspective is called the Demand Labs. It's a response to you as clients or future clients saying, do more hands-on kind of work with us. Tell us about 6 or 8 maybe different specific cases around how to create scenarios or identify root causes when doing demand accuracy or bias investigation. So the entire Demand Labs concept, which you can find in our SharePoint on our website, is around hands-on experiential learning. And so these are some of the activities that we undertake.
Okay, so thank you, Todd. And at this point, we're going to do a couple of slides talking about some available resources, both from Forecast Pro as well as from Oliver Wight. We'll also be talking about our next webinar, which is now available for people to register for. And then we'll take some questions. We've been, if you haven't, let me try that again. If you have a question that you would like us to reply to, please use the chat function in the GoToWebinar dialog. We're going to take a few questions for Todd, again, time permitting. And keep in mind, if we don't get to your question, we will be replying by email, so never fear. So I think I'll start with the left-hand slide, and I'll let Todd talk about the right-hand side of the slide, since he's better versed in that. But in our example session today, we did use the Forecast Pro software. And if you're interested in learning more about Forecast Pro, we'd love to enlighten you. A good way of getting more information is to visit our website. There's a great deal of information there. If you want to get a live WebEx demonstration, which can include using your own data if you wish, you can even just send us a message via the chat function now, and we'll have somebody get back to you to arrange that. But again, I'd encourage you to visit the website, where there's really a wealth of information there. Todd, you want to comment on the right-hand side?
So let me just make sure I'm clear here on the right-hand side. I'm sorry. Which slide is this? I see a slide in front of me. Are you looking at the chat box?
No, actually, I can do it if you wish.
Yeah.
Just a reminder here that Oliver Wight, you can also learn more about their products and services. And they are offering a complimentary 1-hour phone conversation to discuss your current needs. And again, a couple of different ways to request that. We can, if you want to use the chat function and send a request, we'll have Oliver Wight will get right back to you. Alternatively, if you want to give them a call or shoot an email, they'd be more than happy to tell you all about their available services. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay.
Yep, I can talk through this one. So just brief update on upcoming courses. So we do offer public classes. I mentioned Demand Labs and our demand management course. So you see some dates here. So on the left-hand side, demand management course is really an overview for 2 days of best practice fundamentals. We cover the multiple views that you've just seen here in greater detail. We talk about performance measures. We actually walk you through a real-life demand consensus building workshop. So maybe you've got pieces of this, or you're saying, you know, how do I start? This class is a response to how do I start. So if you're not doing demand planning or demand management and want to learn more, a great foundational overview of demand best practices. The Demand Labs, like I mentioned before, a series of really about 8 modules, specific in nature. You can find the detailed titles on our website. But just think about how you may, for example, be thinking, I have a statistical forecast. This is more around when to apply statistical forecasting techniques and when not to, as an example. Or how do I know when to plan at the aggregate level versus detail, which is a very common question that we get from a lot of our participants or attendees. And so we walk through real-life examples, case studies. We load data on Excel templates, and we work as individuals and also as teams through the exercises. A great 2 days, learning from peers, different industries, and a great experience doing that.
Okay, and as this slide mentions, Business Forecast Systems, the creators of Forecast Pro, also offer some other services. We do offer seminars on commonly used forecasting methods, how they work and how they're applied. We have, as you know, an educational webinar series, which also has an archive. So if you go on to forecastpro.com, any of our past webinars are available there. We probably got 15 to 20 hours of forecasting educational webinars that are available for free. So I encourage you to visit that archived webinars and learn about topics that are relevant to forecasters. We also do offer classes, and if you're a Forecast Pro user, training services as well. And we have a blog. It's called The Forecast Pro, and the URL is there at the bottom, theforecastpro.com, where there's a lot of useful articles on topics of interest to forecasters and demand planners. Let's proceed to the next slide, please. We also wanted to let you know we have an upcoming event in October. We're going to be holding the Forecast Pro Users Conference. This is really for the Forecast Pro users who are attending today. This is really our flagship event of the year. For users, it goes for 3 days. It is a mixture of educational sessions, both on forecasting and topics relevant to forecasting, as well as how to implement. There's a large emphasis on how do we actually put best practices into practice, and how do we use the tools that are available. And of course, since it's a Forecast Pro user conference, the tool we concentrate on is Forecast Pro. But it's really a fun-filled 3 days. There's also lots of opportunities for networking, socializing, and as the slide says here, it includes case studies, tutorials, panels, and it's always been a really useful event. So I'd encourage you, if you are a Forecast Pro user, to mark your calendars. You'll also be getting announcements in the very near future with more details, and we have a website set up to provide additional information. And the next slide, please. Okay. As many of you know, because I should probably mention we've had over 500 people sign up for today's webinars. I didn't actually do the country count, but I believe we have over 50 countries represented. So it's a very popular webinar series. It is also generally held quarterly. And our next webinar is going to be on tracking forecast accuracy. As people often say, you can't improve what you don't measure. So it'll be about measuring forecast accuracy, benchmarking your current processes, all with an eye of how do we improve it. So that will be taking place on July 20th, which is a Thursday at 1:30. I actually will be the presenter, and the registration for that event is live. So if you want to visit forecastpro.com and sign up for the next webinar, that'd be great. And obviously as it gets closer, we'll be sent reminders, etc. But I'd encourage you to go ahead and sign up now. Also, if perchance you're not available or don't even know if you're available on July 20th, 2017 yet, there's no downside in signing up, because you will, upon the conclusion of the webinar, receive an announcement and a link to the live stream version of it, or the, I should say, the on-demand version of it. So again, if this is a topic of interest, I'd encourage you to visit forecastpro.com and go ahead and sign up, and we'll keep you in the loop. Let's go to the next slide, please. And I believe we're at the point in the presentation where we're going to pose some questions for our presenter, Todd Ferguson. Eric Sabatis is here with me, and he's been monitoring the questions that have been coming in. And I think we have time for 2 or 3 questions. So Eric, what's our first question?
Yep, we got a couple questions here. This one's coming from a couple different folks. Todd, you mentioned the importance of documenting assumptions. What would you say are the best practices for doing so? And for example, where would you recommend documenting them? And would you say it's the same as, say, comments that someone might enter into a demand planning system or software?
Yeah, so a couple perspectives. So one is, I work with software that actually had the note functionality, so a simple note. And ideally, when we think about assumptions, I want to know what the assumption is. So a 10% growth in a category due to customer ABC. You know, I want to know the timing of when that actual event's going to happen. So if I enter in the system, obviously there's a cell that would denote when that timing is going to be, but I still want to enter that. If I'm not working the software, I have no functionality, I also like to have a simple Excel template. And a good assumption documentation template feels like, tell me about what the assumption is, as I've just kind of indicated. Tell me what the relative quantifiable impact would be. It could be pounds, kilograms, totes, you know, rail cars, what have you, each's, pouches. It also could be and/or revenue. So it's also helpful because we're not just projecting widgets or value, or volume rather, we're also looking at value, so dollars, EBITDA, margin. So I'm thinking about 2 or 3 columns there. Who's the source of the assumption? So who provided the information? So when we need to go back and look at why assumptions didn't materialize as planned, who's the actual person I could go back to? And just think high level. You know, is there a specific marketing person? Is there a specific salesperson? That type of thing. So we have, you know, and then the timing, you know, when that assumption is going to hit. So again, if it's in the system, the more words you can add, the better. If it's in a template, I've seen that also work successfully. And we have examples of the assumption template. Be happy to share with you if that's helpful.
All right, thanks, Todd. And along the lines of assumptions and this idea of gathering it from different places, who should own the demand plan accuracy, and who breaks the tie if the participants who are giving input can't agree? And would you say it's the same answer in most situations?
So who owns, let me make sure I understand. The first question is who owns demand plan accuracy?
Correct. And if multiple people are giving input into the demand plan itself, who gets to break the tie if those folks can't agree?
Yep. So the good news is, in a best practice environment, I'm thinking demand roles now, demand manager, demand planner, is facilitating the inputs. They may be capturing the demand plan as a forward projection, and then when actuals roll in, measuring that. We have consensus around what that plan was in the first place, so we all own it together. Ultimately, the owner of the demand review is the one we would say should drive the discussion around the assumptions, root cause, and corrective action when assumptions don't materialize. So I would like to understand, if I'm going to sell 100 of some widget, what the various assumptions are, if that's going to be 50 from base, 25 from merchandising or distribution activities, 20 from new product launch, and 5 from other. What are those building blocks of demand? And then I want to be able to ideally extract what were my results. So if I launched a new product that yielded 20 out of 100, did I get 20? Was it 10? If I actually think about distribution and merchandising assumptions, did I get the full amount? So just kind of walking through that, that's what I've seen successful. So if you can visualize an Excel sheet with building blocks or demand drivers, and on one column says demand driver, the other one could say June of 2017. What am I resulting from a base perspective or historical perspective, layering up my events, promotions, events, new distribution, new product launches, and another column saying who's going to own that assumption, and then tracking as actuals roll in, did it materialize? So we all own the accuracy information, but when we are not on track, the root cause, as identified and driven by the role of the owner, with the help of the demand manager, says, here's an assumption that didn't materialize. We're not persecuting marketing or for having a new product launch that came at 50%, but we do want to identify the root cause.